1982.
And at that time, you were teaching then, right? That was your
I
kind of your
was,
full-time
yeah,
job.
and I was teaching when the Commitments was released. I was teaching till 1993. And I never saw writing as a way of getting out of teaching. I always thought, I just liked I loved teaching. And, but I just liked the idea of seeing if I had, first of all, I suppose the talent, but then also as I began to sit and write, I suppose the resilience to just sit and write and add to what I'd done the day before and the day before that and the day before that. Because you quickly realize when you're writing, say, a novel, that it is about just sitting and writing. It's not about thinking, or it's not about walking the hills for the perfect word or chatting over cocktails with other writers. That is just a distraction and part of the mythology. It's all about sitting on your own at a desk, if you have one, or at a table, and writing. And I got into the habit of that in 1982. The summer of 1982, Christmas, summer holidays, the day after the school closed, I got the ferry to Holyhead, boat to London, found a bedsit in Wood Green in North London, just to get away from friends and from the habits of Dublin, if you like. Mm-hmm. And I stayed there till the end of the summer. And I went down to the local library most mornings, virtually every morning, and I sat and I began to fill copybook pages with what was a really bad novel. I finished it, but it's never been published. It never should be. It was really, really bad. But it took me several years to do it, to go right through the whole process. And then in 1986, I'd finished that and I was sending it all over to publishers and getting rejection slips and things like that. And in early 1986, I started writing the Commitments. But that, I mean, I ended up publishing the Commitments myself the following year with a friend of mine, John Sutton. So films and things like that were far from my thoughts. You know, I loved the cinema and I went to everything that was on in those days before I had family and responsibilities and things like that. But I was never thinking in terms of it becoming a film. And I suppose when you're living the 5 years between 1986 and 1991, when the film came out, when you're living those 5 years, it feels like a long, long time, but actually looking back on it, it's really a blink, isn't it? You know? Mm-hmm. So the gap between starting to write the book and seeing it on a big screen 5 years later seems now a bit extraordinary. But at the time, my head was down and I was working, I was teaching, I became a father, all sorts of things got in the way of feeling a bit starry-eyed about it, shall we say. Mm-hmm. But it was all about, really, and it still is, it's about being prepared to, the boring fact, it's about being prepared to sit on your own and just write, which is labor, you know.
In the process of, you know, when you obviously brought out the Commitments and, as you said, self-published, where does kind of the whole thing about a film then come about? Is it that somebody has picked up the book, a publisher sees it, a researcher sees it and sends it on to somebody? How are you kind of out of that loop, as it were, until somebody comes back to you and says, we'd like to do something on this?
I've a literary agent and I've a film and drama agent, and a lot of the early contacts are with them and whoever's interested and not with me. And if it's solid interest, then they contact me. Mm-hmm. In those days, I didn't have an agent or anything like that. And within a couple of weeks of self-publishing the Commitments, there was interest in it as a film. I batted that one away, that interest, because I didn't like what they were talking about. They were talking about bringing it to New York instead of Dublin and changing the ending. The band wouldn't have broken up. And I thought, well, that's not, you know, that's not the Commitments. That's not what I wrote. So you can go on ahead and write about a bunch of kids in New York forming a band, but let's not pretend it's anything to do with me. But the following year, when I had published the book, almost immediately, I got a load of padded envelopes and put copies of the books and a covering letter to publishers in London. And there were 3 publishers interested in it. And one man worked for a company called Heinemann. His name is Dan Franklin. And he was my publisher up until November when he retired. So we worked together for 12 novels and a load of other books as well. Wonderful man. He was the most enthusiastic. And unknown to myself, you know, because I didn't really know how these things were done. Before publication, people in the company were sending it out to film production companies and people like that. And the following year, I had an afternoon in a room in London in February, snowing outside, and I met 5 producers. And it was a strange, dispiriting, not exciting at all experience. I wasn't really happy with any of them until the last one, a woman called Linda Miles came. It's always the last one, isn't it? She saved the day. Linda, I had, if I recall, 2 questions. Would the language of the novel remain intact? Because that was a talking point, all the, what's generally called bad language in it. And I thought it was important to keep the rhythm of that language. And then I also wanted to know, did they intend using stars, film stars? Which I thought would be a bit of a mistake, because if you're going to tell a story about a group of unknown people forming a band, I think it helps to tell the story if the faces on the screen are new. If you're not saying, what did we see him in, or what was she in? Yeah. I remember she was a kid in Little House on the Prairie or something like that, you know. So as we do all the time now, and we see middle-aged actors and we say, oh Christ, I remember him. So Linda answered, yeah, the language would remain intact. And yes, no, she thought the whole idea of using stars was a bad idea. So we hit it off immediately. She had just produced a film, Defense of the Realm, with Gabriel Byrne in it. It was a brilliant film. I don't know if you recall it, really brilliant film. And so she had the track record, and we ended up then making The Commitments and The Snapper and The Van and another film called When Brendan Met Trudy together. And so meeting Linda was a great experience. She's a brilliant teacher. She taught me so much about script writing that I probably wouldn't have picked up if I'd done a course or anything, because I never did a formal course. But she was brilliant at pointing out flaws without you coming away feeling too inadequate or not up to the job, you know, because I was a total novice. And I remember, again, it was a long time before email. I posted what I thought were the first 25 pages of the script of The Commitments to Linda in London. And she got back, and I arranged a day off with the school so I could go to London for the day, met with Linda and the co-producer, a man called Roger Randall Cutler. And we went through the 25 pages and they became 8 pages. As Linda pointed out, well, those 2 scenes can go together. That scene is just totally unnecessary. And it was the best education I ever had, really. It was brilliant. And I picked up an awful lot in that day. So that's a long answer to your question, to the extent I can't even remember what the question was.
Well, it's funny, a couple of years ago, I was in a job before I came to Age Action, and I was in an office in the city centre, Dublin city centre, which was the Dublin Transportation Office at the time. And I was sitting down, I was at a meeting with this gentleman who's an engineer with the Dublin Transportation Office. And like you were saying there, I was looking at him and I was kind of going, why do I know this man? I've met him someplace before. I've come across him somewhere along the lines. And I can't remember his character in The Commitments now, but it was Michael Ahern was his name. And Michael played the organ in the church. And his day job is an engineer. That's
Michael
his day job.
He did the film and then went back to the real world.
And that's where I came across him. And I was kind of going, you know, when you see somebody, you kind of go, I definitely have met this guy before. I had never met him, but I'd seen him on screen, obviously, in The Commitments. But we had a question in from a gentleman called Sean, who, and it relates to The Commitments, so I'll bring it in now. And he talks about a friend of his who passed away many years ago, a gentleman called Joseph Fitzgerald, who was in a band in Finglas in the late 80s, and it was called the D11 Runners. And he said they were becoming quite well known at the time in the Irish music scene, and they had no shortage of bust-ups and breakups and funny tales from the music industry. And he always claimed that the band is in The Commitments, or sorry, that the band in The Commitments is based on them. And he wants to know, is that a fact or not?
No, it's not. I hate saying no, but it's not, because I don't know how many times I've been approached by either members of the band or others who were around that circle at the time. I can't remember when the D11 Runners, I went to see them.
So there is a connection.
Playing in a room, because I remember at the Belvedere Hotel. Oh yeah. I mean, I went to gigs all the time, you know. But I wrote the novel in 1986, and I think the D11 Runners were formed after that. you know. And when it came to casting the commitments, Ken, the bass player, had been in the D11 runners and he got a part in the commitments.
Okay.
But I wasn't involved at all in the casting. So I think that's the actual link. But I hate, and the D11 runners aren't the only band who have asked were the commitments based on them, you know. And I can understand it. It was in the air. There was a lot of good music going on at the time. And the D11 runners, I think, they played soul. But to be honest with you, I'd selected soul because it was in 1986 because it was so unexpected, you know. And I thought superimposing a Black American form on top of Dublin, there was great potential there. And I was listening to a lot of soul music, and so that's why I chose it. So I went to see the D11 runners with a man from the BBC, a friend of mine now, Andrew Eaton. That would have been about 1988, I think, you know, when they were up and running in the Belvedere Hotel in Westmount. And it was a great gig. But no, I didn't base the band on the D11 runners.
I'm not sure if Sean is on the call.
I'm often tempted to say yeah and just get the question out of the way. But I suppose I do have to defend my imagination. I made it up.
Right. Well, and one of the other questions that came in during the week was, and you touched on it there earlier on when you were saying that, you know, you had written the book and then the book was picked up and you then had to make amendments and change it into a script, basically to a film script. Yes. Like, are there particular genres of writing that you enjoy more? Like, is it putting together a novel? Is it writing scripts? Is it a children's book? You know, the various kind of pieces you've dipped into in your career.
In practical terms, because I like to work all day, in practical terms, say, for example, doing more than one piece of work is a good idea, because if the gun was put to my head and I was told you can only write one thing, one style for the rest of your life, I'd be a novelist for the rest of my life, you know. But in actual fact, I could write for 2 hours a novel and get quite a lot of work done. Or I could spend all day working on the novel and I wouldn't get much more done. But if I lock myself, well, not literally, but if I come into the room and I work at it for 2 hours, I'll get as much as I need to get done in a day. And then I can close down that file and I can start writing a play or continuing to write a play. And although you're using the English language, the use of the language is so different, because when you're writing a play, and more so even a screenplay, in fact, you're writing instructions for other people, the director, the designer, the actors, and it's really just the foundation of another piece of work, whereas a novel is the entire piece of work. It's the foundation, but it's also the building, and it's the whole surroundings, it's the neighborhood, it's everything. So it's much more literary and every word counts, whereas writing a script, it is, as I said, writing a set of instructions. Obviously, you pay attention to the dialogue and you pay attention to everything, but it's a less intense piece of work. At the moment, I'm writing short stories, and that's an entirely different energy. I would have thought when I set out to write the first short stories, I thought it'd be quite like writing a novel, you know, because I suppose we always think short stories are just little novels sometimes, but it's a strange one. You know, sometimes a good paragraph feels like a good day's work, and the paragraphs become almost like bricks as you build the building. So again, it's a different part of my imagination. Today, for example, I'm planning what, with a bit of luck, would become a television series, and I'm near the end of the planning, and when we stop talking, I'll spend the rest of the morning on that. If I went into the afternoon doing that, I'd probably get no more done. But if I just concentrate on that, that's grand. Close it down. And then this afternoon, I hope to finish a short story. And I'll be using it's almost like the numbskulls in the old comics, you know, It's using a different compartment of my brain. But if I had to select one, it would be the novel, because when you're writing a novel, you become engrossed in the project for years. And it's a gradual getting to know the thing and a gradual getting to know the characters and what language suits them. And, you know, things like their age are vitally important because of the angle they look at the world, so it's almost like getting to know another person, a potential friendship, or even a marriage. You know, you gradually get to know the people, and it occupies a lot more of my mind. But luckily, nobody's put the gun to my head, so I don't have to choose. And one of the nice realizations is that, you know, once I got up and running, and particularly when I started writing full time, is the realization that I was able to do different types of writing. I think there are some writers who can be brilliant, you know, absolutely brilliant, say when they're writing novels, and you'd be looking forward to their new one. But the attempts they've made to write scripts haven't been successful because their imaginations don't go that way. And I think I've been lucky insofar as I can write scripts. Not all of them get made, unfortunately. That's a frustrating part of that particular job. The amount of scripts that end up on a shelf and will never be made, and that always feels like a bit like a waste of time, you know, and a bit dispiriting. But yeah, so there are different types of imagination. Children's books, I don't think there'll be any more. I wrote them for my own children initially, and my own children now are up and running, they're adults. And I don't feel the burning need to write for
maybe grandchildren's books. Yeah.
But that door might be, I don't know. You know, with your children, you have them all the time. With grandchildren, I'm assuming you have them for a while and then you happily let them go, you know.
The piece about, I suppose, writing for children interests me, and I suppose links back to maybe your time as a teacher also. You've been very involved in Fighting Words, a project which again is supporting young people in writing. We within Age Action have a small project going where we work with an organisation called SUAS, and what we do is we go into DEIS schools. We have older people, members of our own organisation, who go in and do one-to-one reading lessons with young people who have been identified through the school as being in particular need for that. And it's a fascinating and a really enjoyable project, both for the young people and for the older people, because it's making that connection, I suppose, between the generations, and it's linking them to reading, which for many young people today, they don't read like we did. The phone takes the place of everything, and the screen. You know?
I don't know. It seems to me that we're always a bit down on the young people, and that seems to be a recurring theme in Ireland since I've been young, you know. And I think one of the really inspiring things about living in Ireland that the young seem to have a big influence on social change and the way we live. And I think it may well be a fundamental difference between the tone of our life here in Ireland and the tone of life at the moment in Britain. So I find when I'm working with young people, saying Fighting Words, we had this, normally we have a transition year group every year and we do a short story project with them. And in the normal run of things, they would go to Fighting Words, which is based very close to Croke Park. It's a big room. And I would go in and walk around the desks, and that's not an option now. So this particular year, this class are in Baldoyle U3A in Cabra. And I met them on Tuesday, and I was brought around their desks like I was in an iPad, so to speak. And they were putting, you know, so I spoke to them through iPad. And just being in the company of them, I found it's like getting your battery charged, because the ideas they have, the mix of modesty and humor, even the masks I found hilarious. All the boys were wearing the plain blue mask, but all the girls had a certain elegance. They all had their personalities stamped on their mask choice. So even things, just being in the company of these kids for the couple of hours on Tuesday afternoon, it was just great. And I think their urge to write, I mean, with Fighting Words, I don't know how many children and teenagers we've worked with throughout the island, you know, because we've Fighting Words Northern Ireland now as well, and we're based in Cork and Galway and all over the place. And we've got projects going, including projects. We've got a brilliant one now where we're linking up young people with more elderly people around Croke Park to get them to assemble stories about Bloody Sunday. You know, now the elderly people around Croke Park weren't around at that particular time. It's 100 years ago, but a lot of them would have heard the stories from their parents and their grandparents. So getting the links between the elderly and the young, it's a great bridge. It's a great creative bridge, actually. And so, yeah, it's a joy. Fighting Words we're up and running now 11 years, and I'm the chair. I've been the chair since I co-founded the thing, and I've been the chairperson since then. And I'm a volunteer as well. I work there, and one, it gets me out of the house, which is great because I work on my own. But I do find being in the company, particularly, it's a great way of keeping in touch with language, for example, with taste. There's a certain stage in your life where you know every song that's in the charts, and now the charts seem to be a bit meaningless. They don't exist as they used to do, and people get their music from so many different sources. It's very difficult, say for me as a writer, to pin down the song of the summer, which used to be quite easy. There was one song. You can't really do that anymore, as far as I can see. But in the company of young people, and you ask them, because a lot of them might be listening to music, with the headphones as they're writing, I say, "What are you listening to?" And they'll tell me, and I've never heard of them, and you get a bit of an education. So it's just great. And as for, none of them read books, they're all looking at their phones and things like that. I don't worry about that at all. I've been in the company of children who are writing novels on their phones. They're texting their pals. And we don't have rules about phones and things like that. They're perfectly entitled to use them. And I say, "What are you working on?" And they show me. They've a 33,000 word document on their phones, which terrifies me. Absolutely terrifies me. But I didn't grow up with the mobile phone, so it's always, I have one, but it's always a bit. I don't trust it. We all we hit the things as we don't quite like them. We poke them, whereas kids are totally. So and they get their information. They create. It may not be in the formal way that we used to do it, but there is great stuff being created. And I think particularly exciting is the use of the language that's coming from, say, boys and girls, young men and women who are living in houses where English isn't the only language being spoken, where there's another grammar. And they're a bit like we did with the Irish grammar, adding it to the English. And there's phrases and words we use that aren't used anywhere else in the English word. These kids are also adding to the English grammar as it's being used on the paper, and it is quite exciting. It's great. It's a bit like I don't know what it's like really. It's just great, full stop.
Well, there's a question just came in actually that's supposed to relate to that, and it's about maybe you've talked about it already in the sense that do you have any views on the fact that on-screen reading results more in scanning of information and a lack of comprehension, that we tend to be maybe speed reading, I suppose we would have called it in the old days?
Yeah, I know that, because I'd have a gawk at the Irish Times first thing in the morning on the screen, and I don't pay it the same attention as I would do. But if I'm reading Miriam Lord or I'm reading Marina Carr in The Guardian, for example, I'll start at the beginning and I'll go right down to the end, or Fintan O'Toole, or But I do prefer. I know personally speaking, because I do have books on my Kindle, and I read them in the evening. But I much prefer paper. I do think I'd probably pay more attention to what I'm reading when I'm turning the page. But I do, and I do know as well, or I've been told by my publishers, that the early fever for the Kindle, the early and the announcement of the death of paper, paper novels, was misguided. It hasn't happened that way. Books, real books, paperbacks, hardbacks are still very, very popular. And I'd imagine during the pandemic or during the lockdowns now, both audio books and Kindle books have, gone off the scale. Sometimes people prefer books, but I do think it's true we pay more attention. But I don't have conclusions to reach about that. I wouldn't be the only person who was really very anxious last week, wondering who was going to be the next president of America. But there was something extraordinary about being able to check your phone every 20 minutes and just to feel, how slow can you count in Pennsylvania?
I think
so they do have their, they definitely do have their, I think, when television came along, it was the death of cinema. It wasn't. You know, all the death, so people are so ready to announce the death of everything, except themselves, that, you know, you just have to sit back and wait and see what happens. I remember seeing a film. I mean, the first film I saw that was made entirely on a mobile phone. And it was extraordinary because it used the limits of the phone. And because it had the phone right up bang against the face of a character who was wandering around New York. And it was an early phone, a Nokia, you know, so it's going back 20 years or so. And it was a full 90-minute film. And I thought, I'm not going to be able to sit through this. This is like having your boring uncle inflict his photographs on you, his slideshow, you know. This is, you know, I'd cut my wrists. But it was actually brilliant because the young lad who made the film, joined the tradition, long form, you know, storytelling with a brand new device. And it worked. And now, as we know, the mobile phones, they're cinema quality, really. You know, it's amazing, really, what happens. So I wouldn't worry about. And if you look at, we're going through a bit of a golden age in terms of Irish fiction at the moment, particularly women writers, and a lot of them are young enough to have grown up with the mobile phones. And yet, like Sally Rooney is 29 or 30, so she's bang in there in that generation. And yet her work is being read all over the world and translated. And what's glorious about it, to my mind, is that it's so plain and timeless. You know, she's a brilliant writer. So, and she's not the only one, you know, so I wouldn't be worried about the technology at all. I'd be worried about my own personal ability to read or to understand it, but that's an entirely different conversation.
And I suppose if I can get a little bit of a plug in for you and for Irish writers at the moment, you know, it's coming to Christmas time. People are maybe thinking about what they might like to give somebody for Christmas. I mean, the thing to do is, Roddy obviously has a new book out called Love, and highly recommend it. But again, I suppose if you're going to order something like that, because again, it's these days, it's ordering online. It's the shops currently aren't open, bookshops. You know, you can click and collect. But do think of your local bookshop. Yeah. Think of your local independent retailer rather than going to the big online companies, because you are supporting local business and business in your area.
There's a new website. I think it's called bookshop.org. I'm not sure, maybe bookshop. And if you go to that, you can order the book, and then I think you'll link you to your nearest independent bookshop, which I think is a great idea.
But we'll certainly have a look at that and send it out in our next newsletter if we can, to let people know about that. One of the questions that came in just in relation to books is, what books do you like yourself? What books do you read to relax, to enjoy? You know, what's your own preferred genre?
Well, the taste is very broad. I mean, if I had to go, if you were told you can only bring one book with you, you know, the Desert Island Disc thing, I would bring anything by Charles Dickens, really. Probably one of the big fat ones, for the simple reason that it would take longer to read. But Bleak House, or I think David Copperfield is probably my favorite novel. But currently I'm reading Maeve Brennan, Irish short story writer, who died in 1993. She worked and wrote for the New Yorker, and she was a first cousin of my brother's. And so she stayed and lived with us in Kilbarrack for a few months in, I think, about 1973. So I knew her. And I'm reading all her short stories and her some of the other prose stuff she did for the New Yorker. Doing my homework for an event I'm taking part in the week after next, you know, with Anne Enright, and the fiction editor of the New Yorker. So it's my homework. But I get up very early to do a bit of reading, and it's sheer pleasure reading her stuff. It is so brilliant. She is so, her Dublin stories in particular are quite extraordinary. There's a collection of stories, The Springs of Affection, and somebody says it's up there with Joyce's Dubliners, and I wouldn't be arguing with that. I think she's just, she disappeared. She was never really known in Ireland because she moved to Washington with her father and her family when she was in her teens, and she stayed. When they came home after the Second World War, she stayed and she moved to New York, and so she wasn't really known over here, but she is now, and that's what's filling most of my pleasure time at the moment, really. But I read, as I said, I like to read good books about music, for example. But most of what I read would be fiction novels. But my taste is very broad. And I'll read the odd crime novel. I love Marion Keyes, for example, as well. I think she is horribly underrated. I think she's really funny and so clever and brilliant. Trying to think what else have I read recently.
I came across a young writer recently again who I hadn't, well, I didn't know she was, sorry, I'll preface that, I'll start it again. Where I'm living in my family home in Waterford, her grandmother lived 2 doors down from me, and I knew her as a child, and her name is Mia Gallagher, and she lives in Inchicore and has just had several of her works published. And again, it's just, it's interesting you told the story about Maeve. When you know somebody and when you've seen them kind of develop and grow up, it makes the whole kind of thing just more personal, I suppose, and more enjoyable.
Yeah, I think, and that's the type of country we live in, where somebody knows somebody who knows somebody. The whole idea, the notion of 6 degrees of separation. Well, we don't need the 6 degrees in Ireland. 2 will probably do us. It's extraordinary how often you come across people who know a private life. Essentially, I don't know how people get on with the private life in Ireland. I would have thought it's close to impossible, really, because somebody always knows somebody else. But yeah, so I'm trying to think. I was asked yesterday what I do, my favorite books of the year, and I was thinking, what are my favorite books of the year? And Maggie O'Farrell's book Hamnet, I think, is my favorite book of the year. It's a novel that looks at Shakespeare's wife, really, and I thought it was absolutely brilliant. And I read it during the pandemic. I actually ordered it online from the Gutter shop. I decided the Gutter bookshop in Dublin, I'd order a few books from an independent shop, and when it arrived, and like a lot of stuff I've read this year, there in the middle of it was the plague. It's extraordinary. I didn't particularly want to read about a plague, but the interesting thing about it was that it's referred to as the plague season. And when the plague hit London, Shakespeare's company they'd up sticks and tour the counties around London, wait until the plague was gone, and then move back to London. Yeah. Yeah, so there's a lesson maybe for us all.
Well, what's that the French phrase "plus ça change" that's today. As you've been talking about your new book about love, and maybe you might just tell us a little bit about what they're asking. The questions are, what's it about? Can you synopsize it? And maybe this is your sell. Get out there and sell love to us.
There's nothing worse than the question, what's it about? One question, I can see the reasonable question, but one is, why did you write this book? And I always feel it makes about as much sense as asking Ronaldo, why did you score that goal? It was there, Yeah. But the book, it's largely it's a conversation between 2 men who knew each other very, very well in their early 20s. They went to school together, but there was a couple of years in their early 20s where, in a way, they shared the same life, or they felt that way. They discovered the pubs of Dublin together. They wandered the world together, the world of Dublin, that is, together. And then they go their separate ways. One of them stays in Dublin, the other emigrates to England, but they meet up now and again. And they used to go on the tear, do the pubs, they don't do that anymore. They usually go for something to eat, bring each other up to date, don't pay much attention to the news about what their kids are doing. They forget what the other guy's kids are called. But this particular night, they're sitting at a table, and one of them, there's the narrator who's called Davy, and his pal on the other side of the table, Joe, makes an announcement that just floors Davy. He's met a woman they used to know, but not very, very well, nearly 40 years ago. And not only that, he's left his family for her. And this brings a bit of tension that wasn't there already, because it's that notion of memory and how we can or can't share memory with other people, And so the novel really is about an evening they have where they decide to go on from the restaurant to the sheds in Clontarf, actually, and then they get a taxi into town and go to a couple of the pubs that they used to drink in when they were younger. And what they're trying to do is in a way, rekindle that friendship, but also to see if they can preserve it, because there are certain points, they're getting drunk as well. So there are several points where Davy, the narrator, feels this is the last time I'm ever going to meet this guy, you know. But so that's essentially what it is, really. It's about male friendship, and it's about grief as well, and about memory, and how we actually make up our own memories, really, because in the telling, when we decide to tell somebody about something that happened, we choose the words, we become storytellers. And it's not to say that the memory is invalid or the memory is fictional, but as we make up our own memories, I think they move away from other people's versions of the memory. And we've all, I'm sure, been in a position, particularly those of us with siblings, where we're sitting listening to a version of what happened being told by a sister or a brother that bears very little relation to what we know actually happened. You know? And sometimes it leads to a blazing row, and other times you just sit back and you listen and you expect. But Joe, one of the characters in the book, there's an episode involving a woman with a baseball cap that has become part of family folklore. And he was driving the car when this happened, and his daughter Holly was beside him. But his wife, in a way, took over the story because she's a brilliant raconteur. And he used to love listening to her. But what has actually happened over the years, it's almost that he's been shoved out of the car and his wife is in the driving seat. And what hurts him is the fact that his daughter Holly seems to think that's okay, because he's left the house, and this is a way of unconsciously punishing him somehow or other. So that's just an example of it, you know. So, but it's just a conversation between two men over the course of an evening, a Thursday evening.
That makes it unique in itself, I suppose. That you know, we all hear about men don't talk to one another, and they certainly don't talk about their feelings. And at this time, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons why it's a novel, because men of that age, they're not trained, or they don't talk about feelings really. So it takes them a long, long time to get to the core or the point. I'd like to think that if they were younger men, it would be a much shorter book, but then it wasn't. I'm stuck with my own age, so they're men of my own age, and it takes a long time to get to the point. But there's I won't give away the ending, because it's I had no idea how I was going to end the book when I was writing it. But two things occurred when I was starting it. One, my mother fell ill. She was 92, so but she fell ill, and I put the book aside while myself and my siblings kind of tried to look after her. And then one of my closest friends, a man I'd known since we were 12, the first day of school, he fell seriously ill, and he died just soon after my mother. So a lot of the energy, the grief, if you like, and grief can be a strange sort of energy, a lot of the energy went into the writing of the book, and it became the inspiration for the end of the book. So yeah.
I heard you talk actually on the radio recently about your mother and her end of life, your experience of her being with her at the end of her life, and it was very moving and it came across really very, very well. And it's difficult. It's a difficult thing to talk about, but I think also talking about it or writing about it can actually help the grieving process.
Well, it actually can. I don't know if it's therapeutic in any way, but when my father died, and this is going back 7 years, I had been writing Facebook little dialogues between two men in a bar. And I met a man in London who was interested in the possibility of a play. And his mother had died recently. And we were chatting about our experiences, in my case, going up to Beaumont Hospital to visit my father and bringing my mother, and his experience of visiting his mother. And by the end of the conversation, I had the plot for a play. One of the men has just been up to visit his father in Beaumont. That's the first act. The second act, he's waiting for a phone call to go up to Beaumont for the last time to say goodbye to his father. And the third act then was the night of the funeral. And it was great to be able to harness the, if you like, the experience of going through that myself, and to create a play out of it. And I remember thinking when I was watching it, the opening night, watching it, which was, it was set in a pub, and it went on in the pub, and the pub was around the corner from where my parents lived in Kilbarrack. And I was sitting there with my family watching it, and I was thinking, Dad would like this, you know? And he wasn't in my mind when I was writing the play, really, although the affection for the son and father would have been. But it was great to be able to, if you like, harness that sadness and make comedy out of it, and something honest as well about grief and friendship. And it was the same then writing this book. I find it's interesting as I get older that in many, many ways, I find more and more things to write about. Because there's so much of the past to look back on. You know, the short story I mentioned there recently, it's the contrast really between a man as he is now and the child he was then, and the gap between the two. And the pandemic, in a way, has ripped away a lot of his, the padding of his life. There's nothing there. There's no routine. And he's exposed in a way, and he's trying to accommodate himself to this new reality, you know, like so many of us are. And if I wasn't the age I am now, that story wouldn't be there in my head at all. And, you know, The Commitments is very much the book of a young man who isn't looking backwards. As we get older, we're constantly looking backwards. And I see it as a, you know, just as long as I'm on guard regarding sentimentality and nostalgia, it's a rich source of material, you know. So I find that in the case of love, particularly, what I really found reassuring about the writing of that is that I had as much energy to write that as I would have done when I was 27, you know. It was, and still do. So it's rather than kind of defying the fact that I'm getting older, it's using the fact. Working very well for me at the moment.
I suppose that's one of our, I suppose, kind of mottos, if you like, within Age Action, is that, like, you know, age is not a barrier to anything, but it is a kind of something that it's an experience that we can all grow and share with one another. And that's through our University of the Third Age network. That's one of the things we try to do, is to get people together to I suppose, to learn about new experiences, to meet new friends. And as we get older, maybe sometimes our circle of friends can diminish a little bit for various reasons, you know, through illness, through whatever else. And it's important that you know, we kind of, I suppose, push ourselves that little bit to maintain those friendships and keep learning. That's the most important thing. Keep the brain active. You've written about the pandemic and how your own kind of feelings about it. I've seen that piece you wrote in the Irish Times there recently, and it's if somebody was to ask you, and I'm going to ask you, what advice would you give to somebody to get through something like this? Because for many people, I suppose, the walls have closed in around. They feel maybe that the walls have closed in around them. You talked about how you've structured your day. You know, you get up early, you read, you go for your walk, you do all that. Like, do you find that's important to help you kind of mentally to keep mentally healthy?
Yeah, I don't know. You know, I'm not. I don't know if you should ever ask the person, him or herself, whether they're mentally healthy. I think it might be somebody else's call. You know? At a facile level, when the lockdown started, the first one in March, in a way, nothing changed for me because I've been working on my own at home for 27 years full time, since 1993 when I gave up teaching. So in a way, my routine wasn't affected at all. But I had been writing a novel that's set in the present day, for example. And as I went to resume it, because I'd been away, I was actually in England when the lockdown started here. But when I sat down to start writing again, I realized that I didn't know what the present day was anymore. You know, it just made no sense to continue. If I'd been writing something set in a historical time, I could have continued. And then I also had 3 theatrical productions, a musical based on The Commitments, the 2 Pints play I was telling you about, and a new play, all of which were to go on this year. All of them postponed or cancelled. So in a way, the scaffolding of my year, the next couple of years, just fell away by mid-March. And it was very distressing, really, really distressing. So I quickly had to come to grips with, I was keen to write, but I had to find things to write about. And it was a bit of a fight, to be honest with you. And there were a few times, I'm lucky insofar as I'm living very close to the sea, and then at the end of the road there's a promenade that stretches for miles, and I've got Dolly Mount in front of me. So even during the 2-kilometer limit, I could get to the wooden bridge in Dolly Mount if people know it and back, you know. So I had the sea and Holt on one end, and then turning around at the docks, and you know, so plenty to look at. The weather was glorious, if you recall, and I have a couple of dogs, and they gave me the excuse to go out walking. But I remember in the early days, I just felt I was walking into anxiety that seemed to be like meteorites coming at me. People coming at me on their walks were like meteorites, and it was rather a horrible time, just for a short while, until I got it to grips with the notion, well, I can write short stories that capture the moments that are happening at the moment. I can write a script. I'm working with a director writing a film script that we hope will somehow capture the time after the lockdown, after the vaccines, when when life is beginning to loosen up again. And which is actually quite easy to imagine, funnily. It may be totally inaccurate, but it's quite easy to imagine. But I found myself by late April busy again, which is great. But that for me is the important thing, to stay busy, to use the feelings at the moment, the strange feelings of isolation, and also the feeling of solidarity that was quite apparent in the first few months. And the feeling, which I think is probably the best feeling of the lot, to come out of this, that we are somehow or other a nation together, you know, despite the arguments about whether it should be level 4 or level 5, or, you know, there is a sense of unity, I think, which is probably absent to the east and to the west of us. So using all this material is, for me, the best thing I can do to cope with. Physical exercise is also great, I've got to say. I hate talking about this as if I'm dispensing advice, because I'm not. But I know that the first day when we were allowed to go 5 kilometers, I walked to the nearest bike shop, and I think I probably bought the last available bike. And I hadn't cycled a bike in years and years and years. And I've no ambition. I'm not wearing Lycra. I just wear it. I'll never you'll never see me in Lycra, but I just love cycling. It's funny enough, because when I'm walking, I'm thinking about work a lot. I'm thinking about stuff. It's all coherent. When I'm cycling, I just drift. And funnily enough, when I'm drifting, last Monday, I just cycled to the end of Kilbarrack Road, where I grew up, and back. And by the time I got home, without actually planning it, I had a story in my head. And that was great. It was good feeling. But I just drift and I listen to music. So physical exercise help, and good telly helps as well. I found we were watching The Sopranos, and you forget how brilliant it actually is, you know. The terrifying thing is series 1 is 21 years old.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't realize it was that old.
Yeah. So we're in series 3. And it's kind of reassuring that it is brilliant. I mean, it's absolutely brilliant. But a couple of episodes of that a night, really.
Well, it's coming up to just kind of gone 20 past 11, and I know you've been talking. I'm sure I noticed you haven't got a cup of tea or a cup of coffee with you beside you there, so I'm conscious of the fact that you've been talking a lot, and it's been really enjoyable. The comments that have been coming in, I don't know if you can see them on your own screen, but people are really appreciative of the fact that you took the time this morning to share some of your stories with us. It was a real pleasure. And the last one that they kind of had comment that came in was, have you any thoughts about Christmas, or any message you'd like to send to somebody to people for Christmas?
No, I haven't thought about it.
It's a difficult one, because we're kind of maybe pushing it out there a bit. Yeah.
Not so long ago, I was on Liffey Street, and I heard a woman saying to another woman as I was walking by, "Listen, if I don't see you before, happy Christmas." And I looked at my watch, because it has the date on it. I looked at my watch, the 5th of October.
Okay.
I thought, that's barking. And in our house, my father's birthday was the 8th of December. And it was a holy day, we'd no work. And when I was a young kid, he was a printer, but he was teaching printing in Bolton Street, which is now DIT, or which is now, I can't remember what DIT is called now.
It's gone to Grange Gorham, and it's G's. Oh yeah, whatever. Yeah.
Going back in the 60s, it's pretty outrageous when you think it. The the college shut down for that day as well.
Mm-hmm.
So like a lot of the country, you know, the country came to Dublin on that day, and we also went into town on that day. And in my head ever since, Christmas starts on the 8th of December, and I don't care about the circumstances. I don't want to know about it until the 8th of December. But it's, in a way, I can see the importance of it, and I think it's great to have something to look forward to. But sometimes when I hear the political debate and about whether we should open up or we should be in level 5 or 4, and the constant references to Christmas, I do feel at times that people who are obsessed with Christmas are treating me like an infant, you know. And I think to a degree, a lot of us are prepared to accept that just for this year and a half, we kind of have to hold our breath a bit, and it's for the common good. And I mean, I know personally from work, I'm missing an awful lot, and hopefully I might get it next year or the year after instead. And I haven't seen my sisters in months and months and months. And, you know, one of my kids, we meet him in St. Anne's Park because it's halfway between where he is and we are. And, you know, you just have to hope for the best when the weather's there. So there's an awful lot happening, but no, I don't, I'm not a, so I hope I'm not disappointing anybody who asked the question, but no, I've nothing to say. But what date is it today? The 12th of November?
Today is the 12th of November, yes. Just looking, because I was going to
say that a good book is a great gift for Christmas time.
Well, that's exactly how I was going to finish. I think if anybody wants to do something or to get something for themselves or for somebody else for Christmas, then there's nothing you could recommend more than to go out and Find Love by Roddy Doyle. And I suppose, Roddy, I won't be speaking to you before Christmas. I will drop you a line later on today. But can I wish you and yours then a happy Christmas on the 12th of November and say thank you very much for this morning. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, everybody.
I was going to drop one there and tell you that we're actually practicing Muslims, but we're not.
Listen, thanks. It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much, Roddy, and best of luck.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye-bye to everybody.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
It was lovely. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye now.
Bye.